What is so depressing about it is that this was maybe the issue, if not one out of the two issues that created support for Trump in the first place. There were two things that Trump said in 2015 in the Republican primary before the 2016 presidential election, which rallied everybody to his side. The first thing was, we need to build a wall between America and Mexico. The second thing was, the Iraq war was a mistake. Those were the two things that drove a wedge between him and everybody else. To some extent, there was his position on trade as well. But the big two that everybody knows is build a wall between America and Mexico. We have borders. We have a country. We have to get illegals out. We have to stop them from coming in. And the second was that the Iraq war and the ongoing wars in the Middle East are draining our country of its resources. They're literally killing us. They were a mistake, and they have to stop. How do you go from that? That was the promise of 2015. Trump literally stood before AIPAC and told those Jewish donors, you won't like me because I'm not going to be your puppet and take your money, like Marco Rubio. Those were his exact words. He said to AIPAC, you won't like me because I'm not going to take your money. I'm a self-funder. That means I won't be your puppet like Rubio is. That was in 2015. The year's 2025. Trump has been elected twice, ousted once, impeached twice, shot in the head, convicted and charged and threatened with hundreds of years in prison, investigated, supporters imprisoned. 10 years later, all of this. Marco Rubio is now the Secretary of State and is pushing this administration against its will into a second Iraq war with Iran. The same mistake over the same issue. What was the casus belli for the war in Iraq in 2003? Fabricated evidence from the DOD and from the IAEA that they were pursuing a nuclear bomb. What is the casus belli for this war in Iran? A fabricated IAEA report and false intelligence from the DOD, from Secretary Pete Hegseth, that Iran is pursuing weapons of mass destruction. And now our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, Sheldon and Miriam Adelson's puppet, and Donald Trump, who has received AIPAC and Adelson and Jewish money, they're going full steam ahead into a war with Iran. Same mistake, same thing all over again. 10 years later, the Trump revolution, and it's the same stuff all over again. A war in the Middle East and a tax cut. Your golden age, sir.
Our president will start a war with Iran because he has absolutely no ability to negotiate. He's weak and he's ineffective.
Speaking of World War III, I'll keep you out of World War III. What would happen if we had a war? We won't, with me. But you will have World War III, I believe, without me. But we won't have.
I will be sure that World War III will not happen. I'm the only one can say it won't happen. But I stand here today, and I'm the only candidate who can make this promise. I will prevent, and very easily, World War III, very easily. Well, here a short time ago, Iran launched 181 ballistic missiles at Israel, and I've been talking about World War III for a long time.
Iran needs to get itself a nuclear weapon as quickly as possible. I have said many times, going to say it again now, whether you like it or not, if I was leading Iran, I would long ago have furnished myself with a nuclear weapon. Given that I'm being threatened daily, sanctioned, strangled, and warned as to the very existence of my state by not one but two nuclear-armed states, Israel and the United States of America. So I don't know why Iran doesn't want nuclear weapons. I can't be certain that they still do not want them. I can't be certain that they do not even now have them, given that experts say the state of uranium enrichment in Iran is such that within a few days they could put a nuclear warhead on the tip. What I do know is that if the United States bombs Iran with low-yield nuclear weapons, then World War III is a distinct probability.
Elon Musk went into the Oval Office the other day with a black eye. That's a little bit weird. Elon Musk came into the Oval Office a few days ago for a press conference with a giant black eye. Is that normal for the world's richest man to all of a sudden have a black eye? He said that his kid hit him in the face. His 4-year-old toddler punched him in the face. That's why he has a black eye. In the middle of all this, you're telling me Elon comes into the Oval Office ready to leave the Trump administration with a black eye, and 2 days later he's saying that Trump is named in the Epstein files, and that's normal? What's more, Elon Musk is taking Stephen Miller's wife out of the Trump administration. Stephen Miller is the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and National Security in the White House. Stephen Miller apparently has enormous influence. He's functioning like the prime minister in the government. And his wife, Katie Miller, was working in Doge. Now that Elon Musk is wrapping up Doge, he's taking her with him to work full-time. Miller is on the side of the president on the bill. Elon is against, but he's taking Miller's wife with him. Now he's got a black eye. Now he's talking about Trump is named in the Epstein files. This is also happening at the same time that Peter Thiel was named in the New York Times as having received $40 million from Jeffrey Epstein. This is also happening, by the way, let's go a step further, at the same time as Israel is trying to push us into a war with Iran. A few days ago, there was a huge piece in Israeli media, not in American media, but in Israeli media, in the Jerusalem Post. It says that Israel is deeply concerned about two people inside the administration, J.D. Vance and Don Jr. Israel is concerned because Israel wants the United States to fight Iran. But Vance and Don Jr. do not. They are working with the president to purge the national security apparatus of Zionists. They just fired a few dual citizens from the national security apparatus earlier this week. And allegedly, Vance and Don Jr. are behind this. They're taking control over the national security apparatus on behalf of America First. And they're trying to purge and sideline the dual citizens, the dual nationalists, dual allegiance having pro-Israel Zionists like Mike Waltz and others who have been pushing us on behalf of Israel to go to war with Iran. Well, Vance is the protege of Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel's being attacked under the auspices that he is in bed with Jeffrey Epstein. A week earlier, Palantir is under attack by the New York Times. They're saying that Palantir is taking over the government and making a database of every citizen. The same week, there's a big piece in the New Yorker about Curtis Yarvin, who is attached at the hip to Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance. Elon Musk is saying that he wants to make Vance the president of the United States. He says that Trump is named in the Epstein files. Vance should then replace him. So you have to wonder, is there more to the story than that Trump and Elon are mad at each other about the deficit and the bill? I mean, maybe that's the case. But it's a little bit conspicuous that all of these tech people are being put at the forefront, and in particular their connections to the Israeli mob in the press, at the same time that all of this is happening. I said last week, it's going to hit the fan imminently between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. The U.S. is purging pro-Israel people from the government. Vance is being blamed. Vance's patrons are being hit in the New York Times and in the New Yorker. Elon Musk seems to be attacking Trump and wants to anoint Vance. Elon has a black eye. Did somebody rough him up? Did somebody put him up to the job of sabotaging Trump in some way? I feel like there's more to this story than maybe we're being told. All of a sudden now, all these things are coming to a head. Jeffrey Epstein, Palantir, Israel's war with Iran, the ongoing purge of the national security apparatus, which has been ongoing, sidelining the dual loyalists. Something tells me there's more to the story here. And I think that if I were to take a stab in the dark, there are machinations underway to undermine Trump to get a war with Iran. If I had to take a wild guess, because when you speculate about these things, and that's really what it is baseless speculation, circumstantial, admittedly, it's all circumstantial. But if you have to look at who would benefit now, at any time, to undermine this administration, with Elon leading the charge and him getting roughed up, it would be some kind of angle to bring Trump down to get a war with Iran. Or maybe secondarily, maybe they don't want the bill because they don't want actually to enforce the border. That might be the only other thing that I can think of, which is that, then again, I mean, look, would J.D. Vance not secure the border? I mean, certainly he would, or he would be in favor of that.
I don't want to see an Israeli flag. I want to see single loyalty to the United States of America. Tell me about the Dual Loyalty Disclosure Act.
Yeah, we swear an oath to the Constitution. And the question is, if you're a citizen of two countries, which oath are you taking more seriously? Or can you take them both seriously? Look, I would prefer that people with dual citizen have to renounce their citizenship in the other country before they run. But at a minimum, we should do what the bill I introduced does, which is require candidates for federal office to disclose whether they have dual citizenship and which countries they may have citizenship in. That way, the voters can decide whether they should be able to represent the United States.
Our loyalty should be singular, especially as an elected representative to the United States of America. Great to hear from you, Congressman Massey. Thank you so much.
What is AIPAC?
AIPAC is the Israeli lobby. And basically,
is that actually what it is? Or?
Yeah, AIPAC is particularly powerful and very good at getting people in a lot of trouble if they're critical of Israel. It's unlike any other relationship between any other two countries. The relationship between the United States of America and Israel is like they get unconditional support from us. We prop them up in everything they do, no matter what they do.
Yeah.
And no matter whether we want them to do something else, whether they do exactly the opposite of what we have. If we just go, hey, I know you've done these 9 things, could you just not do this 10th thing? It's a real problem for us. They go, nope, we're doing the 10th thing, and we still fund them while they do it. And that's true for a lot of different reasons.
Why?
Because there's a very powerful lobby in the United States of America called AIPAC.
Here's what we know about Israel's attacks on Iran's nuclear sites as of Friday, 6 a.m. Eastern Time. Israel launched airstrikes across Iran and Tehran around 3:30 local time on Friday, claiming to target the core of Iran's nuclear program. The U.S. said it was not involved in the strikes. According to Iranian state media and the IDF, Israel's strikes killed top Iranian military leaders, including the heads of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Iran's armed forces, and its emergency command. 6 nuclear scientists were also killed, along with senior figures linked to Iran's nuclear program. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, confirmed that Iran's Natanz nuclear site was hit. Iran told the agency that there's been no rise in radiation levels at the site. In response, Iran launched over 100 drones to Israel, which Israel says it began intercepting outside its borders. A state of emergency was declared in Israel. Israel says it launched the strikes on Friday morning to stop what it sees as an urgent nuclear threat from Iran. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called it a targeted operation to protect Israel's survival, claiming Iran is closer than ever to building a nuclear weapon, possibly within months or even days. Iran has long maintained that its nuclear program is for civilian purposes only. the IAEA and many countries doubt Iran's nuclear program is peaceful. This week, the agency officially said Iran is in breach of its nuclear agreement for the first time in 20 years. A recent report said Iran had enough uranium enriched to 60%, close to weapons grade, to build 9 nuclear bombs. Iran is not allowed to build nuclear bombs because it signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, a global agreement aimed at preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. Netanyahu said the strikes would continue until the threat is eliminated and thanked President Trump for taking a tough stance on Iran in the past. President Trump, who has previously supported strong action against Iran, has not yet issued a public response to these attacks. However, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that the United States had no role in Israel's strikes on Iran and did not offer any military or logistical support. Rubio emphasized that the top priority for the U.S. right now is protecting American forces stationed across the region, especially in Iraq, Syria, and the Gulf, where tensions could escalate. Iran's foreign ministry called Israel's strikes, quote, an act of aggression, and said the U.S., as Israel's main backer, will be held responsible. They also said its military will fully defend the country however it sees fit. This is a developing story. Follow Brute for more information.
This is it. The moment has finally arrived. Hours ago, Israel launched a preemptive attack against Iran. It is ongoing. It is occurring in waves. There have been, at the time of speaking now, at 8 o'clock Central Time, on June 12th, there have been 4 waves of airstrikes against Iran. Started with a surprise attack that originated from inside Iran, actually. Wasn't even believed to be Israeli jets, maybe drones, something else. But an attack originating either in western Iran or inside Iraq. The first wave was launched in a surprise attack at Iran's airports, air bases, and in civilian neighborhoods where the commanding officers of the IRGC reside. There were assassination strikes against Iran's military commanders. Second, third, and fourth wave airstrikes carried out by Israeli jets are attacking Iran's capital, Tehran, oil infrastructure in Avaz, and their nuclear energy and enrichment facilities at Natanz, Isfahan, and elsewhere. It is a massive, unprovoked surprise attack. We're not surprised. I've been talking about it for a long time. But the world was surprised when Israel launched the attack. They say it will go on now for days, maybe weeks. There will be weeks of waves of attacks to degrade and destroy Iran's fortified nuclear facilities, which are buried deep underground and inside mountains, carried out by Iran's Air Force. Understanding that and their ultimate objective is key to understanding how things played out today. They targeted Iran's military commanders with assassination, primarily to disable Iran's command and control, but also to permanently scuttle any kind of diplomacy between Washington and Tehran. Can't happen after this. And as the days and weeks go on, Israel will return to Iran and continue to bomb and destroy those fortified nuclear facilities, rendering them defenseless. Final push probably will be full-on regime change. Netanyahu's already hinting at that. He said that Iran's liberation day is not far off. That means overthrowing the government. That's what they always wanted. I did predict this a long time ago. I mean, I knew this was coming, and I warned people days, weeks, months, years in advance. I was vocally against Donald Trump for this reason. And to a lot of people, that was a mystery. It was so inexplicable, people actually thought I was working for the Democrats because they couldn't understand why anyone, much less someone like myself, would not be voting and enthusiastically supporting Donald Trump in 2024. But if you watch my show, and if you go to my Twitter timeline, if you go to my Telegram channel, if you watch my show, I was loudly and explicitly and vocally warning everybody that if we elect Trump, this was exactly the outcome we were going to get. And I said I couldn't vote for it. It betrays every principle of America First, objectively, but also every principle laid out by Donald Trump in his first campaign. And I said I couldn't vote for that. And like I said, nobody wanted to hear that. It was inconvenient. People said it was crazy. They didn't understand. They didn't want to understand. And so I'm a little bit smug because a lot of people have a big fat "I told you so" coming to them today. A lot. Almost everybody I know. Almost all of my colleagues. Everybody else that does what I do. They either weren't paying attention to this, it wasn't on their radar at all, or they made the wrong prediction. And then when Iran is destroyed, then Israel gets to do whatever they want. There'll be nobody left to oppose them. Whole Middle East will be under their influence. And they're in the center. Think about where Israel's located. They're in the middle of Asia, Europe, and Africa. They're in the center of all global trade. The Belt and Road that China's building, the rail, the shipping routes, all of it goes through the Middle East. And so when you control the Middle East, it's not like controlling, like Mexico or whatever. Right. You control the Middle East. It's like the most important region in the world. It's all the oil. It's all these other energy resources. It's all the supply chains, all the shipping routes.
Is that why Trump wants Greenland?
That's part of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Because of, the Arctic is melting, and so that's going to be viable for shipping. It wasn't viable before because it was all ice, but now that it's melting, now there's going to be a lot of trade. It's also important for missile defense. If a missile comes from China, it's going to come over the Arctic. So we want to deploy radar so we could see that. So it's really for power projection. But yeah, you start to understand it all comes down to strategy, all comes down to military strategy. And Israel wants, if they take out Iran, they control everything, and it's a very important region to control. People don't even realize they're going to become a global power. People think of Israel as like our satellite. They're like our puppet or like a junior partner. In 50 years, Israel's going to be a big player. They're going to be a great power, like the UK was, like France. They're going to be a serious player. So people have no idea, and then they won't need us.
Right.
Then they'll be on their own. So that's a very scary situation where the United States doesn't have power over them or leverage.
Right. Fuck. What about Putin and President of China? How do you feel about Israel?
Well, Putin is close with Israel. People don't realize this.
Yeah.
But that's because Russia has a huge Jewish population, always has. And so Putin has a rabbi, and he has good relations with Israel, and so does China for that matter. But insofar as Israel and the United States are joined at the hip, China and Russia are less pro-Israel than the United States. But they're never against Israel. Israel's part of the Belt and Road, which is China's infrastructure project, and Israel's allied with Russia. So, a lot of people think like, oh, Russia's fighting against this. They have their hands in everything. Unfortunately, the only countries that are against Israel, it's Iran. That's about it, and that's who everyone wants to destroy.
Wow, that's crazy. Makes sense why Fox News and everybody's, the Muslims are a bunch of terrorists. They want to make like we're just going there clean the house because these people are evil and they hate Christians.
Right. Well, yeah, because if they're terrorists, they got to go. So they just say anybody that sympathizes, you're supporting terrorism. It's like the oldest trick in the book.
After I liberate the Jewish people, I will go to Africa to help liberate the black people.
Video footage of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu talking about Israel's goals for Africa in a press conference in Uganda has many on the continent speculating what those plans and goals are. Will Africa be Israel's next target after they completely dominate Palestine? Watch the video and let us discuss.
We have tremendous opportunities. We've solved our water problem, even though we're a very dry land. We've solved our agricultural problem. We produce with great productivity, vegetables, dairy. Always am boasting which cow produces more milk per cow in the world. You think it's a French cow or a Dutch cow. It's an Israeli cow. It's a computerized cow. Every move is monitored, you know.
Russia has just threatened Israel. President Putin had a stern message to Netanyahu and the Israelis. Putin says that there will be consequences and that all of the consequences will be felt by the Israeli leadership. Now, it is worth noting that Russia and Iran does have a defense pact, though we don't know the specific details and if Russia would come into a war to defend them. Following the Gaza war, we do know that President Putin and Russia have distanced themselves from Israel and are close to cutting ties as Russia recognizes Palestine.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the court, it is a great honor and privilege to appear before you on behalf of China. For over half a century, Palestinians in the occupied territory has endured persistent suffering, with many communities dependent on humanitarian assistance for basic survival. Following the October 2023, the escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, even this basic lifeline has been severely threatened. With each new restriction and every law Israel enacts to block assistance, the situation grows more desperate in Gaza and throughout the occupied territories. We are witnessing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, threatening to overwhelm an already suffering people. The suffering of Palestinian people touches the very heart of China. For 12 straight years, President Xi Jinping has sent messages to the UN Special Commemorative Meeting in observance of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, expressing China's unwavering support for Palestine's just cause. China continues to provide humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people, while also participating in broad international efforts to alleviate the humanitarian crisis and support post-conflict reconstruction in Gaza. President Xi puts it simply and powerfully. I quote, "The humanitarian cause is humanity's shared mission," end of quote. This principle guides China's position that the United Nations, as the cornerstone of multilateralism, should play both a central and unique role in leading and coordinating humanitarian assistance. As the stakeholders in this humanitarian mission, all states should work together to provide humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people. Ultimately, the fundamental solution to the Palestinian question lies in the implementation of the two-state solution. This addresses the core of this conflict: Palestinian people's fundamental right to self-determination. At the same time, Israel's legitimate security concerns should be respected. China champions the parties to move forward each other and stands ready to work with the international community toward early realization of this vital goal. Two states living side by side in peace, their peoples sharing the benefits of friendly coexistence. China submitted its written statement to the court in February 2025. Today, I will present China's view in three parts First, the advisory jurisdiction of the court. Second, Israel's obligations as the occupying power to the UN. Other international organizations and third states, namely third parties. Finally, Israel's obligations as a member state of the UN. China submits that the court has jurisdiction over questions requested by the General Assembly, and there's no compelling reason for the court to decline to exercise its jurisdiction. China supports the court's exercise of its advisory jurisdiction in accordance with international law. China hopes that the court will focus on the specific legal questions requested by the General Assembly, building upon its advisory opinion of the July 2024 to provide legal guidance on relevant issues. The guidance will serve to promote lasting peace, stability, and development in the Middle East. Moreover, it will safeguard international peace and security by upholding the authority of international law and advancing international justice and fairness. Mr. President, I now turn to the obligations of Israel as occupying power in relation to the third parties. Since 1967, Israel has been the occupied power of Palestinian territory, including the Gaza Strip, while Israel withdrew its physical military presence from Gaza in 2005. This did not change the status as an occupying power, a position this court affirmed in its OPT advisory opinion. In armed conflict, particularly in the situations of occupation, Israel's obligations as occupied power, specifically in relation to the third party's presence and activities, derive from two fundamental sources of law: international humanitarian law and international human rights law. In terms of obligations of Israel as occupied power under international humanitarian law, four fundamental sources should be noted: the Hague Regulations, the Fourth Geneva Convention, the First Protocol, and customary international law. From these sources emerge five principal obligations, which I will examine in turn. First, Israel has the undisputed primary responsibility to ensure the basic needs of civilians in the occupied territory. The obligation explicitly required by Article 55, paragraph 1 of the Fourth Geneva Convention and Article 69, paragraph 1 of the First Protocol. These provisions require Israel to ensure to the fullest extent all supplies essential for civilian survival in the OPT. Second, Israel has obligation to agree to humanitarian assistance from third parties when the population in the OPT is inadequately supplied. This is not a discretionary choice. Refusing such assistance could constitute denial of humane treatment of civilians or a form of collective punishment, both prohibited under international law. Third, Israel has obligation to allow and facilitate humanitarian assistance from third parties in three specific ways. Israel shall ensure rapid and unimpeded passage of the humanitarian assistance, enable humanitarian personnel to perform their tasks, and facilitate the distribution of relief materials. Fourth, Israel has obligation of respecting and protecting humanitarian assistance personnel and materials provided by the third parties. This entails a negative obligation to refrain from causing harm to them, and a positive obligation to take active measures to protect them. We are deeply concerned about casualties among humanitarian assistance personnel in the OPT. We call on all parties to comply fully with their obligations under international humanitarian law to ensure the safety of humanitarian assistance personnel. Fifth, Israel has obligation not to, for the purpose of civilian starvation, impede humanitarian assistance from the third parties by using siege or blockade. When siege or blockade are not prohibited per se as a method of warfare under international humanitarian law. These methods become unlawful when intended to starve the civilian population. Moreover, as confirmed by the court in its OPT advisory opinion, Israel, as an occupied power, has no sovereignty over or no right to exercise sovereign power in any part of the OPT. In addressing the humanitarian crisis in Palestine, multiple Security Council and General Assembly resolutions confirm and reaffirm Israel's relevant obligations, providing valuable guidance for the present case. It must be emphasized, Mr. President, the principles and rules of international humanitarian law cannot be derogated from unless explicitly provided for. In practice, the occupying power may impose appropriate restriction on the presence and activities of humanitarian assistance only under specific circumstances, which I will now outline. First, activity and movement of humanitarian personnel may be restricted only in a case of imperative military necessity. These restrictions face two critical limits. They cannot constitute a complete ban on humanitarian activities, and they must remain temporary, not permanent. Notably, these restrictions are not applicable to humanitarian materials. Second, specific humanitarian arrangements may be subject to temporary technical restriction based on the reasons of security. However, such restrictions cannot amount to either a denial of humanitarian assistance presence or a general prohibition on the access of the humanitarian assistance. Third, providers of humanitarian assistance may be subject to appropriate restrictions on their presence and activities. If they violate humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These restrictions must be based on sufficient legal grounds and factual evidence, and each case must be evaluated individually. When misconduct occurs, restrictions apply only to the specific individual involved, unless such conduct is proven attributable to the organization or state. As a matter of international humanitarian law, humanitarian assistance is based on two pillars: the occupying power primary responsibility and third parties humanitarian assistance. Unlike the occupied power primary role, the third party play subsidiary and complementary role. The rule applies only when two conditions are met. First, the civilian population's basic necessities are not adequately supplied. And second, the occupied powers has given its consent. Such assistance must adhere to humanitarian principles when respecting technical arrangements established by the occupied power under international law. China knows that. A few written statements assert that the occupying power has a broad discretion to accept or deny the presence and activities of the third parties that provide humanitarian assistance. However, international humanitarian law explicitly constrains such discretion by establishing two distinct obligations. In situation of occupation, the occupying power shall agree to humanitarian assistance from third parties. In situation of armed conflict other than occupation, humanitarian assistance from the third party shall be undertaken, and the parties to the conflict shall not arbitrarily withhold their consent. In the situation of armed conflict, international human rights law complements international humanitarian law. Israel is a party to several key international human rights conventions. These conventions apply to acts done by a state in the exercise of its jurisdiction outside its territory. Therefore, Israel is bound by these conventions in its conduct in the OPT. Israel has occupying power, is obliged to respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights and fundamental freedoms of Palestinian people in the OPT. These obligations include a full spectrum of rights, including Palestinian people's right to self-determination, life, work, an adequate standard of living, as well as the right to food, healthy, and education. More attention should be paid to the protection of the right of vulnerable groups, including children, women, and persons with disabilities. With respect to the humanitarian and development assistance, Israel is obliged to cooperate with the third party to ensure fulfillment of these human rights. This entails both positive and negative obligations. Israel shall actively facilitate humanitarian and development assistance while refraining from creating obstacles to such assistance. Among these fundamental human rights, self-determination constitutes a collective and fundamental human right, serving as prerequisite for the full enjoyment of all other fundamental human rights. The Court has affirmed that Israel, as an occupying power, has obligation not to impede the Palestinian people from exercising the right to self-determination. A key element of this right is that a people may freely pursue its economic, social, and cultural development. The right is also fundamentally linked with the right to development. Declaration on the Right to Development states that the human rights for development implies the full realization of people's right to self-determination. Under the Declaration, every human person and all peoples are entitled to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development. It necessarily follows from that, given the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and their right to development, Israel is under the obligation to facilitate and promote, rather than to impede, humanitarian and development assistance from the third parties. Moreover, Israel is under the obligation to take provisional measures indicated by the Court in the case concerning application of Genocide Convention to the Gaza Strip, and to comply with the Court's specific demands regarding humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, I will now turn to the obligation of Israel as a member state of the UN in relation to the third parties. These obligations flow from three sources: the UN Charter, the Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the UN, and the General International Law. Under the UN Charter and the General Convention, Israel undertakes the following main obligations in relation to the third party at all times. First, Israel is obligated to cooperate with the UN and other member states in providing humanitarian assistance. International cooperation is a fundamental principle of international law and a core purpose of the UN Charter under Article 1. This obligation to cooperate is set forth in Articles 55 and 56 of the Charter. Israel shall give the UN every assistance for any action taken under the Charter, including but not limited to Chapter 7 enforcement measures. Israel shall fulfill in good faith its obligation to cooperate, to safeguard and facilitate the provisions of humanitarian assistance by the third parties in the OPT. Second, Israel has obligation to ensure the privileges and immunities enjoyed by the UN agencies and bodies. These include the inviolabilities of the premises, the immunity from executions for property and assets, and the tax exemptions, among others. Third, Israel has obligation to ensure the privileges and immunities of the UN personnel. These includes immunity from legal process and travel facilities for UN officials, as well as the privileges and immunities of experts on mission. With that being said, I now move on to address Israel's specific obligation in relation to the UNRWA. UNRWA is backbone of humanitarian assistance operations in Gaza. Its role in alleviating the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is both indispensable and irreplaceable. As subsidiary organ of UN established by the General Assembly, UNRWA is entitled to all rights and privileges accorded to the UN organs by international law. In fulfilling its obligation toward UN organs in good faith, Israel shall safeguard and facilitate UNRWA humanitarian operations, protect the safety of the personnel, and ensure its privileges and immunities. By withdrawing from the 1967 interim agreement and enacting legislation to prohibit UNRWA operations, Israel clearly violates its obligations under international law. As set forth above, such action contravene a fundamental principle of international law. No state may invoke its internal law to justify non-compliance with the international obligations. While differences may exist regarding the implementation of the interim agreement, Israel is required to consult and negotiate with the UN in good faith to resolve these matters properly. With respect to Israel's obligation concerning UN peacekeeping operations and their personnel, I wish to make the following observations. The UN peacekeeping operations play a vital role in restoring and maintaining international peace and security. As subsidiary organs of the UN, these operations enjoy all privileges and immunities accorded to the UN. For the UN officials and experts on mission in peacekeeping operation, their privileges and immunities are guaranteed under the General Convention and the relevant international practices. Personnel serving in the national armed forces on their sending states' command and control are protected through status forces agreements between the host state and UN. Where no such agreement exists, customary international law provides these forces relevant immunity afforded to all state armed forces. The Security Council and the General Assembly have adopted a series of resolutions strengthening the importance of ensuring the privilege and immunities of UN, its agencies and bodies, and their personnel, as well as protecting the safety of UNRWA. UN peacekeeping operations and their personnel. These resolutions reiterated the international law obligation that Israel shall fulfill in good faith. As a final point, general international law imposes two obligations on Israel in relation to the third parties in the OPT. First, Israel shall respect sovereign immunity of states, immunity of state officials, and the diplomatic and consular privileges and immunities of third states. Second, Israel cannot exercise sovereign power in the OPT, including any attempt to prohibit UNRWA's presence and activity. Such sovereign powers rest exclusively with the Palestine. Mr. President, the Palestinian people face no greater urgent threat than deprivation of humanitarian assistance. While the court advisory opinion of July 2024 still echoes. The reality of occupied Palestinian territory remains grim. Occupation continues and the starvation persists. The desperate eyes of Gaza's children pierce our conscience with two burning questions. Will international law surrender to the brute force? Will the pillars of civilization yield before the law of jungle? China respectfully calls upon the court to issue an advisory opinion that upholds the integrity of international law and stirs the conscience of international community. Only by safeguarding fairness and justice through the rule of law can we build a community with a shared future for humankind. Mr. President, distinguished members of the court, that concludes China's statement. On behalf of Chinese delegation, I wish to thank you for your patient attention. I extend my appreciation to the registry and the staff for their kind support.